this is why I do what I do. I was sitting in George Square after some degree exams when I was at the University of Edinburgh with my head in my hands, musing on my pure maths paper, asking me to reconcile equations. And this fellow student came up to me, eyes burning, blazing. What's the matter with you? And he shoved a leaflet in my hand. He was something from the Sock, Social Science Socialist Society or something. And it was all about the Alaska pipeline. They're going to melt the permafrost. They're going to disrupt. I thought this is something I could really get into. Um, and 6 months later, I had changed from pure mathematics to what Edinburgh used to describe as the earth sciences or physical geography, which I found, unlike the pattern recognition I was expected to be dealing with in mathematics, I could really relate to. It evoked my place. It helped me establish my identity, and it was a revelation for me, really. Um, this proposition around space and place is fascinating. This is our Tornish up on Ardnamurchan, looking down Lochlan towards Mull, and you see Ardtornish at the bottom, and it sticks out into the sea at one point. And there's this urban myth that exists about the time of the Ordnance Survey, where the Ordnance Survey chaps were out. They were chaps. Were out noting down everything for the first Ordnance Survey, and they used to ask locals what they're called and how's it spelled and what's this. Oh, we called it Ardtornish. Well, it looks like a point. Yeah, that's right. We call it Ardtornish. And of course, if you delve into place a bit more, you find out that Ardtornish means Thor's point in the Gaelic and in the ancient Norse. So we have Ardtornish point, or point of Thor's point, depending on how you approach these things. I've always had a fascination for this proposition around the green consciousness, and Chris Smout's work, which he did for Scottish Natural Heritage, first published for the British Academy, I think, is really quite fascinating. And in this paper, Smout reflects on the different nature of green consciousness, predominantly in the Highlands of Scotland, from a resource for living through in the traditional societies, a resource for sport, hunting, shooting, and fishing, a resource for industry, power, smelting, and currently a post-romantic view, hence the image of the landscape sublime, refuge for people and for nature. I was very content with this, and then about the same sort of time, I visited this place. I don't know if any of you have been or know it, Louisiana, an art museum, modern art museum in Humlebeck up the coast from Copenhagen. It's an astounding place. Changed my life, actually, where you can process through these glazed corridors, admire the species. You can move out and admire the art pieces as well as the landscape. It's insinuated into the landscape, and you go down through a series of rooms where you can reflect on art, periodically opening up into beautiful volumes like this one, which has but two heroic abstract canvases and a couple of Giacometti figures looking out onto the lake. And if you continue this journey, you end up in a belvedere overlooking the Sound, where you celebrate midsummer. And the reason this had such an impact on me is that it was the first time I had seen a major work of architecture where the emphasis of the work was not on the architecture. The emphasis on the work was on its insinuation into the landscape and its respect for the landscape. And I had to go back to school and study design in order to be able to carry this through. So this whole places a theme that runs throughout this talk, and I'll come back to this. But these two books I think are very interesting. James Swan, I think from the 70s, maybe early 80s, Spirituality of Place, and more recently Ellar's book, Places of the Heart, this psychogeography of everyday life. And I will come back to that later on. But right now, I wanted to share a couple of case studies with you and the principles that designers use to intervene in a place if they wish to do so sensitively. And I've listed some of them here. And of course, I don't have the time to deal with them all. And forgive me, I don't want you to teach anyone to suck eggs. But I thought I'd maybe pick up on one of them about proportion. And I'll do that throughout, actually, pick up on key points of research that I think are particularly relevant, significant to reflect on. So when we apply these principles, what are the outcomes? Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? Is it a place? Oops. And I thought I'd say something about my about Fibonacci spiral, which of course generates the golden section and the rectangles, and it proceeds to infinity. And we can use the golden section to analyze our buildings, our interventions, Parthenon here, and similarly Villa Savoye by Corbusier. And it really does demonstrate, I think, to some degree, that although the rules of proportion have been followed, beauty is, to a degree, in the eye of the beholder. It's all around us. The golden section from Leonardo, Corbusier's modular man, not forgetting Criado Perez reminder about the invisibility of women in the design process. But we see this in the natural world. The golden section is an invaluable tool to help us understand and imagine form and proportion. The nautilus, a Hokusai's wave, the growth of a tree. But you can, I think, take this to absurd levels, and we shouldn't go too far with it. It's a strong tool. And when asked to work with the renewal of some important and significant sites in Edinburgh, notably the redesign of the garden in St Andrew's Square, the brief was very interesting. You would imagine that a lot of these would be what everybody would want to see, the original qualities of the Georgian Square, open to the public, a venue for the festival, 21st century standards. But in particular, the one that caused me quite a lot of consternation was fitting the square within the principal desire lines of the present new town to ensure activity and use. Preoccupation, I think, rather than necessarily disagreeing with it. If you're entrusted to deal with something like St Andrew's Square, you're dealing with a whole series, the reconciliation of a whole series of contrasts, not least between the fact that at the time it was laid out in a Christocentric society. It was hierarchical. It was for the aristocracy, if you like, and ladies and crinolines to process around, take the air. And today we're in a multi-faith society, and some of the challenges that brings upon us, not just the monuments in the square and Dundas Monument and the consequences of that today, most elegantly or eloquently dealt with by Sir Geoffrey Palmer, and there's now some interpretation there to deal with it. So we had a lot of precedents to stimulate discussion about what we might be trying to seek in George Square. And this was the thing that, excuse me, in St Andrew Square, and this was the thing that caused a lot of preoccupation. The pedestrian movement around about the square. And I sought to try and understand the geometry better, and the recognized desire line. And this is what was meant by this point about pedestrian movement, about the ability to walk from Harvey Nicks to Jenner's in the shortest possible route, and take the air for ladies who lunch. And I was concerned how to reconcile this. So we made a study in depth about the geometry of the square, the principal axis along George Square that terminates on the Dundas Monument, behind which you see the Palladian Pavilion of the what was the Royal Bank of Scotland, and behind that now the Walnut Whip that is the St James Centre. Two streets completely puncture the square. One arrives in the square, and when you actually look at this geometry, you discover it's very clever. It's not a square at all. It is a square, but it's not a square. And this space in the center is a rectangle. And when you start to look at that, you realize the golden section comes into play. And lo and behold, if you rotate the north-south axis by the golden section, you get this diagonal, which I thought, since it's a recognized desire line and for everybody to use, it was also something that you could perhaps use the geometry then to have something you're prepared to stand up and justify. You didn't simply put a path through for the sake of it, but you understood the functionality of that path, and you also understood the aesthetics of that intervention. And this is the design that it came up with. We came up with, and it gives you the understanding, by using the geometry in this way and by using proportion in this way, it gave an underlying rationale for the intervention. And on the left, you see the recovery of space in order to represent a square, and on the right, the creation to maximize the garden space in the center, where inappropriate species need to be taken out. I dare say, this previous speaker, many of you maybe got something to say about that, but at least the opportunity to recreate the annular ring, which creates this transition from the city through to a space of some tranquility. Of course, the proof of the pudding in a public space is use, performance in use. And you see the Dundas column there, but you also see a number of things that, if you are involved in design of public space, you have to deal with all the time. Why have you made this? Why have you made this stone so high around the edge of oh dear, around the edge of the, excuse me. Oh, good. Around the edge of the central feature, people will sit on it. People won't sit on it. It's cold. It's stone. This is Edinburgh. People never sit on it. Well, there you go. The kids will drown in the water feature. Well, the water feature is 30 millimeters deep, and the kids love it, and they don't drown. So this was something that of which we're proud and very happy with, and it's rather nice to be able to have made a mark on something so cherished and valuable as the World Heritage Site. Won some awards. I think the only good thing about winning an award really is honoring something that my father once said to me: is if people have got something good to say about your work, Brian, get it in writing. So it's quite nice to get something in writing from the president of the Landscape Institute. To the other side of the world, and they're at Yangtze Delta. In fact, the year that we won that award was the year we won a competition as a team to look at the construction of a new town in the Yangtze Delta. And this is the huge city that starts in Ningbo through Hangzhou, Shanghai, Suzhou, Wuxi, Nanjing, about 100 million people. The milk chocolate that you see on the left there is the Himalayas being washed out into the South China Sea. And the Chinese don't half move at some pace. So two views of Shanghai from 1990 and 2010 are the development of Pudong. The competition we won was for this little red circle in the bottom right there, for an island that was identified to grow the city of Zhoushan. This is what the island looked like. I'll talk about the tapestry in a moment. You see the you see the relief. Quite a charming island, existing on more than subsistence architecture, charming places, which of course we campaigned to keep. And those black squares, the indigenous industry. So as well as fishing, the local people were salt makers, back-breaking work where they evaporate the water, create the salt. It's an organic, sustainable product. And of course, the chance of any of that, we tried really hard to encourage our clients to consider at least a salt making museum as part of the town. So the master plan was duly produced in 2009, trying to follow all of the best principles of urbanism and those points I've talked to you about. And in 2022, some dozen years later, the town had been delivered. And of course, with the hat of the green conscious design, we had sought to at least find a way to interpret, to bring in Chinese tradition into the landscape that was remain. One of the things I should say, that although in urban design there is a degree of difference, or more than a degree of difference, between Chinese approach and the Western approach, in landscape it's very similar. And in the center of these images on the right, you see the faithful reproduction of the landscape principles that we had worked on with them. They really look after you. May just be able to see the rope that's wrapped around the semi-mature trees to help resist transpiration, and the degree to which they protect their speed. They don't just plant them and leave them in the urban environment. They look after them with a great deal of concern. I'm just going to close off on this section, but I can't really do so without talking about the third aspect of things that changed my life as a practitioner, an academic, a teacher, researcher: community engagement, not just not consultation, but genuine engagement. This was something, a charrette we did in Scunthorpe. These kids were channeling their inner Banksy here, but it was really interesting. Nobody had really listened to them, and as the weekend went on, they moved from the wall and got right into the discussion, and became a voice. And I think it's really important to stress that whatever we do in professional action, this has got to be shadowed, particularly if we're dealing with urbanism, if we're dealing with the public realm, public space. It must be shadowed with an active engagement if you want people to buy into what you do. So these experiences really provoked in me. If you're concerned about the environment, it really is important to get involved in environmental action, and that if you want to do sensitive intervention, it requires a high degree of skill, intervening by design, not by regulation, which is often what happens in our cities. And then finally, and forgive the paraphrasing of Lincoln here, this work should be done of people, by them, and for them. And I express this as seeking to find a reconciliation between land, people, and city. And the article is important here. The land. It's not land as a tradable commodity. It is an inherited resource, thinking back to Smout and green consciousness. It's not just people as in numbers, but it's in the form of we the people. Um, and it's not just any city, it's the city. Um, it's about specific propositions of reconciliation. And the reconciliation that designers do, and I'm indebted to my professor of architectural history and urban design for saying at the turn of the 21st century that the challenge for us as designers is the reconciliation of the spirit of the place, the genius loci, with the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist. And I'm just about to go on talk a little bit about some of what those are in urbanism today. This is what the economists and their concrete boots refer to as supply and demand. If you like, it's a little bit more poetic and a little bit more hopeful to talk about genius loci and zeitgeist. Now, I'm sure the SDGs need no, I'm sure we all sleep with these under our pillows all the time. And forgive me, as I say, I really don't want to verge into territory which is at least as familiar to all of you as it is to me. But the most important thing in my work for the UN has been not so much, or not only the SDGs, of which there are 17 together with about 81 targets, but the articles in the text of Transforming Our World that introduced the SDGs. Article 2 talks about far-reaching and people-centered goals and targets, transformative. And significantly, number 5, that the SDGs and their targets are integrated and indivisible to balance the requirements at that time voiced of sustainable development, economic, social, and environmental. This takes us into systems design. And I think that it's why we often see the SDGs represented as a circle. It's why the National Performance Framework for Scotland and its associated outcomes are represented as circles. We're being invited to adopt systems thinking and understand the interrelationships. Now, this guy, Joan Claus, Habitat 3 in 2016, the United Nations has Habitat every 20 years. The first one in 76 in Vancouver, the second in Istanbul in 96, the third one in Quito. And Klaus, I mean, Habitat 216 followed the year after the Paris Agreement and the agreement, the conversion of the Millennium Development Goals into the Sustainable Development Goals. And the focus on the city, because this is the century of the city, the first time in human history that urban dwellers,
Brian,
yeah.
Brian, that's our 25 minutes.
Oh shit. Right. Okay. Okay. I'll speed up. I didn't hear the 15-minute warning. Never mind. So I was asked to write a report about the UNECE. It's complex, 56 member nations, the world from Vancouver to Vladivostok. 56 member states, 3 continental countries, 3 microstates, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino. 17% of the global population, 45% of global GDP, and 66% of the world's fresh water. 263 cities of 500,000 or more. It's the only part of the UN that's governed in a cohesive way that encircles an ocean, and it's the Arctic Ocean. And seeing this, of course, there's a way that the UN normally represents its logo is very interesting. The distribution of cities across the world, and the cities of the north see 85% of air travel go through them. And the huge concentration of knowledge contained in the cities, notably of Europe and North America, you see in the pie chart on the right there. But incredibly important, the other important thing about this zone of the world is that it contains the taiga, and that we all live between, by and large, between the Arctic Circle and the Tropic of Cancer. It's the largest green space, apart from maybe the Sahel, but that's in the world. It's greater than the Amazon rainforest, and it's a biome growing at 3% per annum. So the report that came out of this talked about people-centered integrated approach. I have to say something about demographics. Absolutely key to all of this. The vicious cycles of demography, sprawl, and shrinking cities, but the kind of possible beneficial one of concentration of cities. And the best way to illustrate this is by reference to a city like Atlanta. So this is Atlanta in Georgia and Barcelona, where you can see they've got the same population. Atlanta's 25 times the size of Barcelona, and it has a carbon footprint of 10 times that of Barcelona. Or another way of looking at it is you can fit 8 of the world's megacities into the built-up area of Atlanta. But I became very interested in these megacities, which the North doesn't really have megacities in the same way that the East does. But I became very interested. We call these super cities, like the Great Lakes and Boston, Washington. And the other thing that this report did was to identify the transition since 96 and Habitat 2 until Habitat 3, transition from the industrial city to the knowledge city, and the importance of place in all of that. I was heard talking about this, and the Urban Lab was commissioned to look at whether or not any of these things applied to Scotland and Scotland's urban age, Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Edinburgh. And that work is full of things like the fact that the 3 cities, Aberdeen, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, and their regions on the diagram, Aberdeen, grey, Granite City, Glasgow, green, Deer Green Place, Regal and Imperial purple for Edinburgh. When I told the different cities, well, that's okay, that's fair enough. And then the beige is the city regions. These 3 city regions account for 85% of Scotland's knowledge jobs, 75% of the growth sectors, 70% of employment, 65% of population. And we speculated whether or not these propositions of the super city might apply to the UK. The jury's out on this. I kind of think it does. We're all familiar with Glasgow New Middleland is Newcastle, Middlesbrough, and Sunderland, Northern Horseshoe, because it looks like it's consuming Wales, and my own personal Sowot, which is south of Watford, my term for London. The challenge was the relationship between these different forces and how we perform systems design. We were asked again, Chair, how am I doing? Am I out of time now?
You have about 10 minutes left, but that includes time for any questions.
Aye, okay. Well, it's okay. I think I can get through this in about 3 minutes. We were asked again in 2002 to look at this, particularly because of COVID. What's changed? What stayed the same? What's new? What's unknown? And we said we would do it as long as we could look not only at COVID, but the climate emergency and the shadow of Brexit and the global financial crash. Now, yet another fabulously complicated diagram, but picking up on highlights from research as we go and demographics and the demographic time bomb. It's really interesting and of vital importance, in my view, to Scotland. So the table on the left, we hear about, it's great, Scotland's growing again in terms of population. And over the period 71 to 20, Scotland grew by 5%, Finland grew by 20%, Norway by 38%, and New Zealand by 78%. And when you look at the geography of that growth in the map in the center, you see that the only places that are growing actually are the city regions of Edinburgh and Glasgow, the city of Aberdeen, and the outlier that's Orkney. And there's some specific reasons for that. The other thing that's interesting here is that for the majority of Scotland, we're seeing a small decrease in population, but a more significant decrease in aspects of the West Coast in particular. And the graph in the top right really shows what's happening, that from 2000 to 2020, in terms of the natural regeneration of the population in Scotland, it dropped by 15%. And it was only by migration that we were able to hold on to the population. We had a 17% net migration into Scotland, and you can see what has happened as a consequence of EU expansion, freedom of movement in 2004, and then later Brexit, and what that has done to Scotland. So this systems thinking, in my view, is utterly central to all of the interventions we do. We need to share all of these things, as I said, between Brian and Brian, about what walls are for and what the habitat is. We have to understand all of these things. It is about demographics, climate, and technology, as it always has been, but it's real. And this cycle might be able to be made benign, but more than likely, it's likely to be made toxic unless we get, frankly, better leadership than we've got at the moment. The only people I've found that have really got a hold of this is Kate Rayworth in her Donut Economics, where she proposes the environmental ceiling and the social foundation. And we try and occupy that central space, the safe and just space for humanity. The diagram on the right shows you that we're not doing terribly well, really, and that we are bursting the social foundation, and we know that, and we're overshooting the challenge. And this has been picked up by Attenborough, Mark Carney, and many people. And I think it is a visual representation of what some of this systems thinking is about. So bringing it all back home, my last set of slides are about the work I did as City Urbanist for Glasgow and published the Place Commission report. And it touched on the point I introduced earlier, and we tried to explain. I mean, we all know kind of what we mean by place, But if you're going to intervene and you're going to do things, then you need something more specific than the place principle requires everybody to work together. So Carmona's research about place quality that delivers on place value, and the attachment, place attachment is now a big thing with the Arts and Humanities Research Council that goes back to the green consciousness, I think, and how these outcomes, social, environmental, and economic, are paralleled by health. Well, this is a map of the shatter zones of Glasgow. We started all of this work with the Place Commission, and then COVID hit. So we had to do all the engagement online, which we did around about what we call the place ecosystem for Glasgow, the international metropolitan and everyday, looking at people, places, protagonists, and policy. And we categorized the different performance of Glasgow as an international city, a metropolitan city, the bigness of Glasgow. We steadfastly refuse to understand the bigness of Glasgow, and the everyday city, which is really, in many regards, the most important. These diagrams are interesting because on the left to show the geography of carbon retrofit, and on the right, the geography of disadvantage. And we find there's an inverse relationship. So the places with the greatest disadvantage are the places with the least requirement for for carbon retrofit of domestic dwellings. So Glasgow performs better. The local authorities that perform worst are, guess what, East Wren and East Dunbartonshire. And the Goldilocks local authorities, who are in the middle, are South Lanarkshire and West Dunbartonshire. We don't have a big problem of carbon rent. Well, we all have a big problem of carbon, but it's lesser there. The 20-minute neighbourhood, and we sought to bring Glasgow to life with a series of place stories, which got a big tick from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Storytelling is now a valid research pursuit, which is quite nice to know after 40 years of anecdote. And there was some really interesting synergies between, for example, the Clyde in the Classroom, which has gone out to teach freshwater ecology to 75% of the primary schools in the west of Scotland, and the Clyde Carmet Forest. And if you bring those two together, you get this map of the metropolitan nature of Glasgow. Glasgow's very good at doing some things. The Clyde Gateway was an urban regeneration company set up with Thatcherist propositions, and the New Gorbals, a registered social landlord, New Ground Housing Association, with much more social intent and objectives. Nonetheless, in Glasgow, we managed to generate outcomes that are very similar to one another. So the Place Commission work has sought to shift the emphasis from plans and targets to outcomes, transfer assets to communities, understand accountability and responsibility through things like the housing associations and community development trusts, have a bureau of a commando of a dozen people or so that take on board the partnership, leadership, and championship, and we have enabling bodies, and we tell the world about it between 2028 and 2030, which we're trying to become carbon zero, because 28 is the 40th anniversary of the Garden Festival, and 2030 is the 40th anniversary of the City of Culture. So urbanism is the pursuit of urbanity, which is a tautology. I use Armstrong's definition. Most of neoliberal economics concentrates on economic and political development and the sophisticated pursuit of individual happiness. Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as community. The collective system of values is essential, together with intellectual and artistic excellence, if you're going to achieve this system's thinking. Urbanism is positive and intentional, and addresses entropy, which causes a decline into disorder. And that comes through natural processes and man-made processes, war, greed, and so on. It's a daunting challenge. Urbanism is not just an abstract ideal, it's about creating the right conditions to make places work for people. And I can't find a quotation that's better than this one from Queen Jane, who talks about the city delivers something for everybody only because and only when they're created by everybody. My current preoccupation, and my last slide you'll be glad to know, is what I refer to as the Higgs paradox. John Higgs' book, The Future Starts Here, Adventures in the 21st Century. Higgs says if we're to build the city of the future, we must first imagine it. And he goes on to say, but maybe not quite as crisply as this, what happens to our collective consciousness and mental health if the only futures we can imagine are apocalyptic and dystopian? We need hope. So is green consciousness a precondition for urbanity? Yes, it is. It's not any more of a precondition than social consciousness or economic consciousness. These are all necessary conditions. But in my view, it's only if we move towards a much more systems understanding where we are all heard, all voices are heard. Urbanists listen to Brian about his walls and his bryophytes. It's only if we do all of that, and when we reach a conclusion and a point of travel for any one of the SDGs, we first test it against all of the other SDGs, because the best thing for the system may be the suboptimal for what you yourself are trying to achieve. Chair, thank you very much.